Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a powerful story from Afghanistan, a struggle that wasn't just about fighting for resources or rights, but about the fight to even have the words to name an injustice and to finally be heard.
I want you to think about this question for a second. It really gets to the very heart of the experience of Afghanistan's Hazara people. It's a question about knowledge, it's about power, and it's about the fundamental struggle just to be understood.
So, to really get a handle on this, we need to start with a concept that might sound a little academic, but it is incredibly powerful. It's called epistemic injustice. Now, that term was developed by a philosopher named Miranda Fricker. And put simply, it describes a very specific kind of harm, one that attacks your value as a person who knows things. It's when you're unfairly dismissed or silenced or just totally misunderstood, not because you're wrong, but because of who you are.
Okay, so this idea basically splits into two main types. On one hand, you've got testimonial injustice. This is pretty straightforward. It's when prejudice makes other people doubt your word. It's the world telling you, you are not credible. But then there's the second type, hermeneutical injustice, which is way more subtle and maybe even more damaging. This is when the society you live in literally lacks the shared language, the concepts to even describe what you are going through. It's like the world is telling you, sorry, we just don't have the words for your suffering.
All right, so with that framework in mind, let's see how it shines a light on over 100 years of history for the Hazara people in Afghanistan.
You know, when you look at this timeline, you can see this absolutely brutal cycle. It all kicked off with horrific state-led violence way back in the late 19th century. And while there were these brief moments of progress and agency, like during the communist era, they were always followed by more conflict and this deep systemic discrimination that just never seemed to go away. And the scale of that initial violence, it's just staggering. Some historians estimate that up to 62%, more than half, of the entire Hazara population was either killed or forced into exile. This wasn't just a battle. This was a foundational act of violence that basically cemented their marginalization for generations.
And look, this isn't just some dusty old history. We're talking about the modern era, from 2001 to 2021. The Hazars were facing violence from all sides. You had hard violence, targeted bombings of their schools and mosques. You had soft violence, like being passed over for jobs. And then you had this deep structural violence where things like national budgets and international aid were just consistently steered away from their communities.
So by 2016, you've got all this history, all this frustration just boiling right under the surface. And then it erupted, sparking one of the largest social movements in Afghanistan's entire modern history. And you know what the trigger was? It wasn't a bomb. It wasn't a battle. It was a debate over something that sounds, well, kind of boring. An electricity power line. But that power line came to symbolize a whole century of inequality.
Okay, so here's the play-by-play. The two-tap power line was originally supposed to run through Bamiyan, a historically neglected Hazara majority province. It was a huge deal. But then, all of a sudden, the government changed the route. Their official reason? It was cheaper. But for the Hazara community, this was just the final straw. They saw it as yet another broken promise, another deliberate act designed to keep them in the dark. And right out of that anger, the Enlightenment Movement was born.
And we have to be absolutely clear about this. This was never just about infrastructure. It was a fight for dignity, for recognition, and for justice.
The government tried to frame this in a very technical, very clinical way. They insisted, hey, this is purely about cost and engineering. By doing that, they were effectively dismissing the community's entire lived experience of discrimination.
But the movement's response was just incredible. They completely reframed the whole debate with statements like this one. They made it so clear this wasn't about wires and poles. It was about the systemic degradation of their people.
This slogan just took off because it captured the essence of their struggle so perfectly. The pain wasn't about the lack of electricity. The real pain was the difference, the state-sanctioned discrimination that made them unequal in the first place.
Now, tragically, the movement's largest protest ended in a horrific terrorist attack that killed 86 people. But even in the face of that horror, its impact was profound. It was permanent. It literally reshaped civil society in Afghanistan forever. I mean, the impact was just immense. The movement created this new, unified political consciousness. It turned isolated victims into a collective force. It pushed women to the forefront of activism. And so crucially, it forced a national conversation about systemic discrimination that had been buried for decades. It basically became what our source here calls a laboratory of learning for civil rights in Afghanistan.
And this brings us right back to where we started.
The movement managed to overcome that hermeneutical injustice, that lack of words, by creating what scholars call critical rights literacy. For the first time, they had the shared concepts, they had the language to understand the very structure of their own oppression, and with that, they finally had the tools to fight back.
So the story of the Enlightenment movement really leaves us with this one powerful question, and it suggests that maybe true peace doesn't start with laws or resources. Maybe it starts with the most fundamental human right of all, the right to be heard, to be understood, and to name your own truth.